So, good afternoon to everybody. We have the pleasure to welcome for this press conference Dr. Lembit Wego, Mrs. Gugu Malangu, and Professor Jim Shaoyong and Mr. David Churchward for this press meeting about promoting quality medicines and saving lives, commemorating the 50th anniversary of the WHO program to improve medicines quality worldwide. So I think it's quite interesting to hear you. So on the behalf of the Press Club, Swiss Press Club, I have the pleasure to welcome you. Before to give you the floor, I would ask to sign our golden book. Yes. And please, just give you just a signature. I give you a pen. Yeah, or below. Below. Yeah. Okay. Up to you. And the little souvenir, yes, cartoons from our foundation, Cartooning for Peace. Yeah, and for the, yeah, okay. Okay, so thanks a lot. And now I have the pleasure to give you the floor to Dr. Lembit Wego for introducing this press meeting. Oh, you can stay, you can sit. Up to you.
Some slides. So
okay, good.
More convenient.
Just push on the button when you speak. There.
Thank you. So, very good afternoon to everybody, and thank you for coming to this event that we are organizing in conjunction and with the help of our hosts here to commemorate the 50th anniversary meeting of the WHO Expert Committee on Specifications for Pharmaceutical Preparations. And this is a bit difficult to capture because we have the 50th anniversary, but it doesn't mean automatically 50 years, because the committee is actually much older than 50 years. It started first in 1947, but it didn't historically meet every year. Now we have the annual meetings, and we are probably a bit better organized and on track. So what is it all about? And this is something that we have put forward the heading because, in fact, this is all about really promoting quality of medicines and through that saving the lives. Now, if we look what's the importance of the medicines for the public health, then of course one could tell that availability and access to good quality, safe and effective medicines is in a way a key contributor to achieving public health objectives, whether we mention sustainable development goals or universal, nowadays more universal health coverage. To achieve global public health objectives, you need to have, of course, functional and effective health systems. But sometimes we forget that ensuring the very important input of the medicines, you need also, as a part of functional and effective health systems, to ensure the quality, safety, and efficacy of medicines, you need also national and regional regulatory systems, which should be seen as integrated part of health systems. And of course, these systems, to be effective, they need tools. And these tools should be science-based, and actually it is science-based quality standards and regulatory guidelines. This is what are the tools that the regulators use to ensure that all medicines that get to the patients are safe, good quality, and effective. And of course, this is what is sometimes difficult to capture, but there are standards and quality issues related to the concrete products, but there are also more general standards that apply to the, let's say, manufacturing of the products, but also to the supply chain. So it is specific and general approach that you have to combine. And now, quality assurance, I think it's always a bit difficult task to understand, because people are not capturing immediately all the complexities. And I have sometimes compared it to the aircraft, because we are all very aware of the sensitivity that if you take the flight, you feel usually safe. And people say that flying is nowadays probably one of the safest way of transport. But in some cases, I have the feeling that if we would compare globally the medicines with the aircrafts, because they both have to do the job, then, of course, in many big auditoria, we would not have even half of the people. Because if the quality standards would be still the same for the aircrafts that is today for the medicines, then probably some people would not reach to the meeting place because the planes don't take off, or they fall down before reaching the meeting place and you miss your participants. So in case of the aircraft industry, I think they are a bit lucky, because the consequences are very visible and very easy to identify. Now, what we have the problem with the medicines is that actually if you look the medicines, they all look nice, they look even perfect. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they are nice, perfect, safe, effective, and on quality and do the job. To take the judgments about the medicines is very complex and complicated issue, and often not understood by the lay public. It's often that even nowadays the pharmacists and medical doctors, healthcare professionals, unless they are specifically trained, can't take meaningful judgments about the quality, safety, and efficacy of the medicines. Now, why we have the quality standards and why it is so important? I can bring some very concrete examples. It's based on our alerts that we are issuing only in cases when there are very serious issues. And this is the alert which is concerning a very well-known medicine. It's the old medicine that is basically generic medicine, cardiovascular medicine, which actually caused a lot of death and also hospitalizations due to the severe adverse drug reactions. Now, what was the problem there? Why this tragedy happened? And the moral, what we, after the investigation with the government who cooperated with us, can conclude, it was the negligence of the manufacturing side and not following the standards for the manufacturing, not following the good manufacturing standard practices. And as a result of that, it was a deadly mix-up, because by accident, likely another active ingredient which was in the content-wise deadly content was going into this medicine, and it started to kill. Second, it's another very complex issue. It was, again, coming up with a very old, well-known medicine, dextromethorphan, that something went terribly wrong. And it again started to kill the people who used this medicine. First of all, those who used very high dosage. And it was first very difficult to understand what's the problem. It's an old, well-known medicine produced all over the world. And it turned out that this medicine, where the active ingredient is dextromethorphan, contained quite substantial amounts of levomethotrexate, which is another isomer and doesn't tell maybe not technically qualified people, but actually this compound is very toxic and it's actually a narcotic drug. So this was why the accident happened. Now, partly why the accident happened was, as it's an old drug, nobody had looked, on the standards also, how we regulate this product, the quality specifications. Is the standards that are used to determine whether the product is of high quality, enough to exclude this type of mix-up with another toxic isomer that could happen. And as a result of that, it's a good thing saying that also standard setting is living process, and if you find the gaps, you have to address them. And this is the concrete example from the expert committee work, where the expert committee has tried to take measures to improve the monograph of controlling the quality specification of these drugs, to make it more tight, to exclude this type of things happening. The same, by the way, happened with another drug, which was heparin, which was widely all around the world becoming a problem, and the regulators had to take measures to improve the quality standards. Also, if we are talking about the quality of medicines, there is a lot of challenges, and I can mention only one probably, or one example. The world is changing, and unfortunately, it's starting to be more complex and sophisticated. Formerly, it was much more straightforward. People had very close relations between those who produced the active ingredients and excipients to put the drug together. Nowadays, the supply chain is having a lot of intermediaries, crosses borders, it's globalizing, and you can see the past and present. Present situation is much more sophisticated. It's much more cross-border actions, changing the hands, going through different routes before reaching the patient. That, in turn, also is putting pressure to those who are controlling the quality of the product and the supply chain. Now, coming back to the work that the expert committee does, the expert committee is doing standards to help to regulate the medicines to ensure the quality. And they are written standards, but they are also physical standards, which are reference preparations that are used in lab quality control. And of course, in the nowadays world, nothing is standing completely alone. So the expert committee is very closely collaborating with other professional societies, regulatory networks, and all those who can contribute, and trying to look that with standard setting we are going more into the one direction than in very many different directions. And this is what is called convergence. And of course we try to capitalize on the work done by other parties who have the relevant expertise, and avoiding unnecessary duplications, and in certain cases giving added value. Now the guidelines and reference standards and all the standard setting work, we'll try to make it as much as possible also available from this expert committee in other languages. And actually I'm very happy that I have our Chinese colleague here, because I have an example that how China has been upfront in translating the expert committee materials. There is a nice box they have recently come up with, the translated text of this expert committee. And finally, before giving the word to my colleagues from different parts of the world, I think those who are dealing with ensuring the quality of medicines, they are constantly facing challenges and meeting expectations. And this work is really to try to capitalize on what has been done good, but it is never enough. You have to continue this work, addressing challenges and meeting expectations, and we hear more about that in the following presentations. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rego, for this introducing presentation. Now I have the pleasure to give the word to Mrs. Malangu from Zimbabwe. So please, I let you speak.
Thank you very much. I have been asked to talk about access to medicines and how the WHO guidelines that are developed by the expert committees can help national authorities, particularly those in resource-limited settings. It is generally understood that norms and standards are the key pillars to good regulatory practice that ensure that medical products, including health technologies, conform to appropriate standards, so that we then have quality, safe, and efficacious medicines and medical products at the end of the day. These standards and norms are essential for industry, as well as regulators, as well as global procurement agencies in a highly globalized industry. Countries, particularly in resource-limited settings, often have very limited capacity to develop their own guidelines or standards for the various areas of medical product and health technology regulation. We therefore rely mainly on the WHO for guidance and direction in this respect. A role that the WHO Expert Committee on Specifications for Pharmaceutical Products has done very well since 1947, when its predecessor first met. So it is the 50th meeting, not the 50th anniversary. Medicines circulating in international commerce are rarely manufactured in the countries of use. Often, the manufacturing occurs many countries across continents. Therefore, it is prudent to have a single recognizable set of requirements or standards that is applicable and used by all countries, manufacturers, to facilitate greater access to medicines for the public. As such, we, for instance, in my own country, Zimbabwe, and the same applies to many other regulatory authorities in the same settings, WHO is the first port of call for standards or guidelines for any regulatory area or aspect. We have adopted several relevant WHO guidelines, such as the Good Manufacturing Practices, Good Clinical Practice, GCP guidelines, guidelines on donations, guidelines for registration of medicines, variations, amendments, amongst others. In fact, I think we've adopted them almost wholesale. There are also general guidelines particularly useful for those establishing regulatory authorities, such as the WHO Blue Book. We call that, it's an essential tool. It's called Marketing Authorization of Pharmaceutical Products with special reference to multi-source or generic products. A manual for national medicines regulatory authorities, NMRAs. It's an excellent tool for regulators in resource-limited settings. It is quite essential and handy for regulatory authorities who are establishing their medicines registration systems for the first times. But even for those who are already functional, we find this manual very useful as an induction tool for new assessors. In my organizations, our structures, systems, and standards are largely based on the WHO norms and standards. We follow the WHO assessment tool to ensure that we comply with whatever regulatory requirements are set out in that WHO assessment tool. For this, we're very grateful for the guidance role that WHO plays in this area. Guidelines often require contextualization to specific country situations. Whilst there are other important and useful international initiatives that set norms and standards, such as the ICH process, countries like ours predominantly rely on the WHO guidelines, as these are usually developed taking into account the context of the majority of the member states, which are situated in resource-limited settings. Thus, there is really need to make extensive changes to the guidelines and standards that we get from WHO. A number are adopted without changes at all, such as the GMP guidelines, and then there's the application of the WHO certification scheme for medicine circulating in international commerce. All this saves time as well as technical resources, which are usually in short supply. Thus, the responsibility of developing new guidelines is generally, we leave it to the WHO, and resources, priorities, and attention in our settings can then be focused on adopting these relevant guidelines, as well as implementation to ensure that the public has access to quality medicines. You all know that scientists rarely agree, and we had evidence of that this week during our expert committee meeting, where scientists have different views. Thus, often there are many positions on one issue. But WHO then helps to bring together experts from these different settings and country situations, and the result is usually a global consensus. And we know about global consensus setting in our expert committee. For instance, when the biopharmaceutical classification system, the BCS system, based biowaiver guidelines were introduced by a well-resourced agency in 2000. This was limited only to one class called the BCS Class 1 APIs. The World Health Organization extended this class to Class 3 APIs when it adopted the BCS biowaiver approach in 2006, thus making more products included in the process. Today, there is convergence, and most regulators are now accepting Class 1 and Class 3 APIs. This global context that WHO takes is important in facilitating cooperation, harmonization, or convergence in the regions. It is easier for countries and regions if they have been applying the common WHO guidelines to agree to work together, as we have seen in the East African Community EAC harmonization process. And in our own region, we have a small group called Zazibona, where 4 countries have a work-sharing initiative. And then also there's the WHO collaborative registration process. Although WHO sets these norms and standards, the capacity for implementation is still limited in most resource-limited settings. For example, despite WHO recommending demonstration of interchangeability of multi-source generic products almost 20 years ago, that is in 1996, when the first guidelines were published, there is still limited applications of these requirements that have been updated twice in 2006 and 2015. That's a lot of scope to optimize the application of the available tools developed by WHO to ensure quality, safe, and efficacious medicines and health technologies. It is noted that inter-country differences in requirements act as a barrier to access to medicines. Adopting common standards as set by the WHO will generally facilitate greater access to medicines through convergence and harmonization. In any case, these guidelines do go through numerous consultative processes prior to final adoption. This week we had one that had gone through 8 cycles of consultation before we finally adopted it. Member states, and particularly national authorities, should actively participate in reviewing, commenting, and providing feedback on the WHO draft guidelines before they are adopted, such that the final outcome is indeed an acceptable consensus document ready for implementation. In conclusion, the WHO Expert Committee on Specifications for Pharmaceutical Products has played a key role within the core function of the WHO, that of setting norms and standards for pharmaceuticals and for the member states. This has allowed national authorities to be focused on implementation of standards and guidelines to ensure access to quality, safe, and efficacious medicines. I thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Malangu. Now we have the pleasure to give the floor to Professor Jin Xiaohong from China.
Thank you, Chairman. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's my great pleasure to have this unusual opportunity to give a short presentation at this commemorating the 50th anniversary of WHO ECSPP press conference. The title of my short presentation is Update on China's effort to protect its population against poor quality medicines. As all of you know, poor quality medicines are a major public health risk for all communities. The phenomenon has grown in recent years due to making poor quality methods becoming more sophisticated, and they are looking so similar to the genuine product that they deceive health professionals as well as patients. Eliminating them is a considerable public health challenge. In China, as elsewhere in the world, poor quality medicines mainly occur in rural areas where drug administration is weak, since the institutes for drug quality control are specifically located in the urban area. In order to combat poor quality medicines and to protect the people's health living in rural areas, under the instruction of the China Food and Drug Administration, the National Institute for Food and Drug Control have developed mobile labs for field testing. We now have more than 400 mobile labs running in China to detect these poor quality medicines. Since there is no single detection technology capable of identifying all poor quality medicines, including spurious, falsely labeled, falsified, counterfeit products. The use of multiple complementary technology can provide a more complete pictures on the overall quality of given medicine. In the mobile lab, we have used non-destructive instruments for visual analysis and physical chemical analysis. For controlling the external appearance of the medicine, a multi-wavelength illuminator can be used to check the secure packaging, insert sheets, and label security markers, even of the surface of the tablets and capsules of the specified medicines. For internal control of the medicines, near-infrared and Raman spectral photometers are used to detect poor quality medicines. The authentic pharmaceutical products spectra library has been established in advance using samples from annual national drug quality surveillance in China. We will continue our efforts to protect our population against poor quality medicines in China. Recently, as requested by the WHO pre-qualification team, PQT, we are willing to cooperate with PQT to develop the appropriate tools for determining potential substandard or counterfeit products. The first pilot study will be with pre-qualified anti-malaria medicines. These are amodiquine artesunate tablets, artemether lumefantrine tablets, artesunate mefloquine tablets. Since artemisinin was invented in China, we would like to develop some effective measures against poor quality anti-malaria medicines to ensure their safety and efficacy. Moreover, this experience gained over a decade is being useful in the drafting process of guidelines for the quality control laboratories in other countries. A text is under development in WHO to assist and build the capacity of national quality control laboratories facing similar challenges, and our National Institute collaborate in this effort. I sincerely hope that the cooperation between WHO and China will be successful. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Xiaohong. Now we have the pleasure to give the floor to our last speaker, Mr. David Churchward from United Kingdom. Just push the button.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for the opportunity to speak to you today on the important topic of globalized supply chains. To understand the current challenges to the supply chain, I think we need to start with some history. So supply chains of the past typically were based on national manufacture and supply models with what we call vertical integration. So often the product was developed at a single site, with that site manufacturing perhaps its own active substance as well as the dosage form, and often even sourcing other raw materials locally within that territory. And this was often for the local distribution of that product, local supply. An extension of that model then was an international supply from that vertically integrated supply chain, where that individual site or single territory would then supply to multiple countries. But the current supply chain model is very different to the old vertically integrated system. We are now seeing global supply of raw materials into the manufacturing site. We're also seeing partial manufacture, where the initial manufacturing site may supply their bulk product to another territory and another manufacturer, perhaps for packaging or further processing, and then again onward supply to another territory for further manufacture, final packaging or analysis, and then subsequently supply to their destination markets from there. This supply chain becomes even more complex when we consider the distribution of those finished products throughout an individual community or country. So this illustrative example of the supply chain touches 14 different national territories, and it's very different to the historical position. And we need to make sure that the global regulatory networks are able to meet the needs of this changing industry practice. Now, of course, these diagrams are only illustrative, and they're certainly not unique. Similar models are observed across many other national territories across the globe. So the global supply chains do, however, offer opportunities and challenges to supply. So first of all, the opportunities, well, firstly, there's cost-effective manufacture through reduced operating costs of staff and equipment, and also economies of scale. And this in turn enables an affordable access to treatment when health budgets of nations are sometimes stretched. It also provides access to medicines which, on a national manufacturing and supply model, may not be commercially viable. So we may have a viable option to manufacture globally for multinational supply. There's also the opportunity for specialist knowledge and capacity in the manufacture of certain products or dosage forms, which enables one or maybe two manufacturing sites to develop specialism and invest in the technology required for that particular product, and also to gain further information from frequent manufacture, which can then translate into improved quality. But of course, there are challenges with this model as well. The global supply chain in itself may infer some degree of vulnerability, both in terms of storage of the product during transit, and also as the supply chain becomes more complex, there becomes the opportunity for insertion of falsified products into the legitimate supply chain. Supervision at a distance is also a challenge both for regulators and for industry, particularly over long distances and time zones. But perhaps the most visible issue to the patient is the global impact of supply chain failure, often where more than one country is impacted by a failure in the supply chain, potentially many thousands of miles away. So we need to rise to this challenge. And I think there's international acceptance that no single regulator can fully supervise a global supply chain. So there's increased focus on global regulatory collaboration. And that's through international frameworks and individual agreements, which enables convergence in standards, sharing of resources and information, and also inspection and enforcement activities. And there are a number of initiatives globally which are supporting this work, such as the Pharmaceutical Inspector Cooperation Scheme, work through a coalition of medicines regulatory agencies, ICH, and also some of the coordination work which WHO supports. In terms of the inspections, we're able to collaborate and share inspection findings, and in some cases perform multi-agency inspections of an individual manufacturing site for global supply. In terms of enforcement, there's a real success story with multi-agency collaboration coordinated by Interpol and WHO in something called Operation Pangaea, which has taken place annually since 2008. And in that time, the annual operation now involves more than 100 countries across the world in preventing and stopping the supply of illicit medicines and communicating those risks to patients across the world. In 6 years of activity, this initiative has taken down more than 57,000 websites selling illicit medicines. It seized 28 million fake or illicit medicines with an estimated value of $92 million US, and made 880 arrests across the world. Both PICS and WHO are continuing to provide resources and coordination efforts in conjunction with national experts to provide training and building capacity in the global regulatory system. And we're also seeing that national regulators are taking an increasingly global outlook in the way in which they perform their national mandate. So earlier I mentioned that the impact of failure in the global supply chain may lead to shortage. And that poses a significant risk to public health because it can impact patient treatment by perhaps less effective or higher cost therapeutic alternatives, thus removing budgets from other health initiatives in countries. It may also result in errors where healthcare professionals or patients are unfamiliar with the dosage regimes or the strengths of therapeutic alternatives. But in extreme cases, there may even be no availability of any treatment for a particular disease, with clear impacts to the patient. So reliable supply is a key focus for national authorities and the WHO, and regulatory oversight increases its focus on supply chain resilience as well as quality. And we're seeing further evidence of that through regulatory collaboration in the reduction of shortage risks, better supply chain visibility, communication, and globally coordinated risk-reducing actions. So national regulators are aware of global market supply chains now. They're also more aware of sole sites of supply, and they're able to work with their counterparts in other authorities to alert to problems at an early stage so that coordination of actions can take place and we can reduce the impact of shortage to the markets that are supplied. So as an example of this international collaboration in the reduction of shortage impact, I just wanted to briefly run through a case study from 2012, which illustrates how a number of different regulators can work together in the interests of global patients. So this related to a single supplying site for the worldwide market of a particular medicine. This site had experienced manufacturing and QC failures, and as a result, supplies were quarantined and they were unable to supply any of their markets while they investigated. For this particular medicine, there was no therapeutic alternative for medical treatment, and the only remaining alternative for the patient was radical surgery, which was actually life-changing radical surgery. So the impact to the patient of this global shortage was significant. So the international regulatory community faced what we refer to as a regulatory dilemma. Do we continue to accept a potentially defective product and at least provide some degree of treatment for these patients, or do we have no product at all and unable to treat at all? So in order to reduce the risks to the recipients, 5 national authorities across the world collaborated in assessing the risks associated with this product and agreed with the manufacturer a protocol for assessing the quality risks for individual batches. And where the risk balance was favourable for continued supply, those regulators enabled those products to be provided to patients so they could continue with their treatment. That also then enabled batch release to specific markets which had the greatest need, and we were able to reduce the impact of the shortage as a result. So what does the future hold? Well, I think it's certain to say that there will be increased regulatory convergence and harmonisation of standards in future as collaboration increases. We are starting to see examples of not just regulatory collaboration, but also collaboration between regulators and industry associations on strategic health and compliance issues, such as reducing shortages, discussing indicators of quality and compliance, and better communication of quality and shortage concerns to the healthcare community and patients and regulators. And we're now starting to see the outputs of these collaborative efforts making their way into good practice standards for international acceptance. There will be continued focus not just on the quality but on consistent supply of medicines. And I think this global supply chain with coordinated regulatory oversight can continue to improve health across the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Churchward. I don't know if there are questions, but maybe if I can raise one. As a journalist, as a non-expert of this problem, what are the main problems you meet? I mean, is it shortage or fake fake medicines or out of date medicine? What are the main problems you meet on the ground? And what are the countries or the regions most affected by such problems? I don't know who can. I
suppose maybe everybody from the panel is putting forward the perspective. So maybe Gugu, you start.
Yeah.
Okay. Yes, I can start. Our jurisdiction is a highly regulated jurisdiction. So we generally have done surveys, but we don't find a lot of substandard human medicines. However, we do find substandard veterinary medicines for the animal sector because we're an agro-based country. So that can be sometimes problematic on the ground. In terms of expiries, again, in the private sector, for instance, the stocks are managed very well because there's money involved there. In the public sector, sometimes you have supply situations, changes of regimens, and then you may find yourselves with products that then expire, on your hands before they are actually utilized. The other challenge that we face is when we actually are now wanting to approve marketing authorization is the quality of the submissions that we get from applicants sometimes. And because we have been involved with the WHO on the pre-qualification side, we perhaps have now higher expectations for the manufacturers, and therefore we find that sometimes this can be a challenge. And therefore, the fact that you then don't approve these products, it also has an impact on access of the products onto the market. And so very often you are then asked to perhaps authorize on a special case-by-case basis medicines that are not yet licensed, but the patients need them. Yeah.
Okay. I don't know if there is maybe in China, or what is your experience?
In China, as I mentioned, the poor quality medicine mainly in the rural area, in the countryside, because in China it's so big. In the city it's okay, but in the rural area, especially for the common use drug, the anticoag and sometimes antibiotics are substandard or expired. So now we developed a mobile lab to detect, to make a fingerprint to see this is real or not. So, and especially for even the visual analysis, you can see the authentic of this. So this is another thing we are facing the challenge is this poor quality medicine maker very smart now. They just sometimes make the drug complied with your national specification. Sometimes you cannot differentiate, but they use a chemical API, not GMP. So this time we have to use another method to detect them and see them.
Okay. Maybe another perspective.
I think certainly within Europe and some of the work that we participate in internationally, there are perhaps two particular challenges through very different routes. One is through the regulatory system, the regulated supply chain, and I think one of the significant challenges that we see is in the reduction of shortage. Either a shortage that has occurred and some of the collaborative actions and working with health authorities to reduce the impact of that shortage and to locate alternatives. But perhaps more challenging is managing the possibility of shortage due to compliance failures, where an organisation, for whatever reason, is struggling to achieve the required standards, but we know that taking action to stop manufacture altogether will in itself lead to shortage. And we're looking at ways in which we can take action at an early stage to alert to these possibilities, encourage the organisation back to a state of compliance, and also prepare for the possibility of action in future should the situation not improve. So that's work that's ongoing. I think the other challenge really is in the area of fake medicines and illicit medicines through the unregulated illicit supply chain, and that's a completely different issue because that relates to criminality and people working outside of the regulated system, and it's different colleagues in national authorities that particularly look after that aspect, and where things like Operation Pangaea are having such an important impact. You did mention where in the world has the greatest effect. I think our answer to that is global, both in terms of global source of the problem. Many countries are found to be the source of one problem or another, and also with the global supply chain, many countries in the world are impacted by an individual problem.
If to put it a bit global perspective and look at covering all the regions, then I think both the substandard, poor quality medicines is continuous problem, and also unfortunately falsified medicines. WHO is running the global monitoring project of trying to get more data and insights into the falsified medicines. It's quite unfortunate to see that on the top level, while we are also nowadays talking on the very high level, governmental level, policy setting level, about the antimicrobial resistance, for the example. Now, antimicrobials, unfortunately, are listing the highest incidence of reported medicines that belong to the category of substandard, spurious, falsely labeled, falsified, counterfeit, and most of them are falsified. So apparently, due to the popularity of antibiotics among the population in many regions, and unfortunately due to the availability to the patients without any prescriptions, then this is quite a popular group. Also, antimalarials are very popular, but practically there is not a single medicines group that is not affected by falsification. Even very rare medicines, sometimes you find falsified products. There are some very rare, let's say, eye medicines, and you still can find falsified products. So that is still continued problem and needs addressing. Substandard, it is probably very much region, country, and product group specific. In some regions of the world, you could say that probably some therapeutic groups of the products or categories of medicines are probably more vulnerable to the quality failures than others. In some places, it's more general improvement of quality standards of the manufacture needed, in combination with also, of course, with building more supply chain security. And I agree with our last speaker in that if you look nowadays, the regulatory systems in many countries are coming up. And I have said, and I say it repeatedly, people like to regulate products, but they often fail on country level to regulate the supply chain. And partly it's not to be blamed to the regulators, because in some jurisdictions they are not directly involved in regulating all components of supply chain. It's some other parts of the government. So it is a collaborative effort, but there is no need to regulate the product very precisely if, as I have said, and I repeat to say it, it's unfortunate, 50 meters from some regulator's office, you can buy anything imaginable and non-imaginable. So in this case, regulating some products has limited value. So this seems to be still the problem that we need to tackle.
Thank you very much. Do you have any figure about the costs caused by counterfeit or substandard medicines, or in terms of money, US dollar, or lives, maybe saved life? I don't know, it's just a question, but maybe.
But if it is a good man like you, or that one like me?
Well, this is a very good question, But the trouble is that to the very good question, you often don't have a good answer. Now, my answer is that actually there is a process ongoing in the framework of WHO work, because in the context of the member state mechanism of substandard, spurious, false label, falsified, counterfeit medicines, SSFC medicines, there is a special work stream looking on the public health impact of these type of products. And this is work in progress. It was discussed during the last steering committee meeting of SSFC, member state mechanism, and it's extremely complex to have this type of calculations because the data available are not really, it's a bit, you know, like sampling the river. Yeah, somebody has been putting there something bad in, you take samples, the water is very bad quality, but you go next time, next day, it may be perfectly clean because it has been going away, and next time it may come again. So sampling one time gives you some sort of like a picture snapshot, but it doesn't give you the overall picture, and it's very complex and costly also to do the huge number of quality sample surveys and try to put it together. So there is now a group of epidemiologists, experts on the quality, the public health experts. They try to come up with something, and I wish them good luck. It's a very sophisticated business.
Thank you.
Boris Engelson, local freelancer. One of you said that it is beyond the capacity of any single regulator to tackle with this problem. Should I stick to that statement? Because there is a simple solution. You consider that sampling is too costly, although we have to do it for restaurants, for instance. You may know or not know that in Geneva, every second restaurant will kill you, and the authorities in charge of that will never publish the list so that we know which half, which second, and which first will kill you or keep you alive. But this is still one of the basic tasks of the state, in the view of some citizens like me. And secondly, one should focus on the last mile of the supply chain, that is the pharmacist. If you make the pharmacist liable, and in most countries, especially rich countries, nobody knows anymore what is a pharmacist useful for. We have in Geneva 3 drugstores per street, each of them, I think, if I am not mistaken, having a pharmacist in charge who has studied 5, 7, or 10 years. And in fact, he's a shopkeeper. He does not do anything different than someone selling Coca-Cola. Maybe it is time to give these people who find their job very bothering and long for great scientific destiny, to give them a real role. And this would be the simplest and cheapest probably way to make sure that whatever you traffic before the shop, it will not come out of the shop to the user, to the patient.
I like your passion because it's similar to mine, but I may not necessarily share all your views. The reason is simple, because also, as I said, nowadays, even the pharmacist, without special training and special equipment available, can take the judgment. That's the problem. So it is also, another thing is that putting it to the end user in nowadays world, well, the product may be actually manufactured in 3 to 5 different countries, each operation done in different jurisdiction. You probably have no other good way than in trying to achieve that all these jurisdictions keep eye on what's happening. And this is something that the world is moving towards. But as any big changes, it is taking time, and although it is obvious, it is sometimes, you know, people emotional barriers of doing something new and desire to continue what they have done is sometimes very difficult to overcome, to make them things doing differently. But the train is moving in this direction clearly, and that's a very encouraging statement I can have, because today the regulators work together more than they have been working ever together. But it's still not enough, so you have the point.
And what about the involvement of consumer organization and patients organizations?
If I may, again, they are increasingly active, and there is increasingly consideration of their input and views, and also in terms what we talked about, the falsified medicines, there are reports coming from the consumers, and that is very good, welcome change, because they are also actively part of doing the reporting, and we're actually thinking also how we could reach better out to the healthcare providers and patients at the same time, not relying only, you could say, police officer can't stand behind every car, yeah? And the driver may do bad things, but you can't put a police officer in every car to ensure that the driver fulfills all the rules and regulations. So you have to involve then other parties and try to build the network that is together collectively more efficient, and this trend is also ongoing. More involvement of the consumer.
Thank you. Is there another question or remark or comment from the room? Yes.
Fine.
Thank you. So you mentioned the fact that somehow the world has been quite successful in regulating the flight companies in terms of safety, etc. How do you explain that it is so difficult to achieve the same thing for medicines, knowing that, I mean, there are many different publications, and you gave very good examples of numerous problems that have happened and are still happening, and number of deaths following quality issues related to medicine. So that's my first question. Second is that we are talking a lot about falsified medicine, and of course I can only adhere to the big problem. We are talking less about falsification of data, also called more politically correct data integrity. And my question is, would you consider in WHO pre-qualification to have a sort of policy against data integrity? Because to be honest, I'm a bit concerned when I see some publication of recent notice of concern from on one company, you know, of over 12 pages of very serious numerous and critical observation made while still those product remains on the WHO pre-qualification list. And for me, it's not, it's a kind of compromise that is probably based on quality risk analysis, but seen from outside is still a bit worrying thing. And my last question, and I know that Sabine has provided me the answer already, but because this was issued by the lady from Zimbabwe, I also very much acknowledge and thank WHO for having published the BCS guidelines some time ago. However, many different experts, worldwide experts, also currently are saying that those guidelines are not in line with the views of different experts in terms of their classification, BCS classification. And because all the pharmaceutical companies and procurement agencies are using such guideline as a tool, as a reference for deciding whether bioequivalence needs to be done or not, I think it's really urgently needed to revise such guideline. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Elodie, for these questions. The last one is the easiest. The update is ongoing in this expert committee. Second, I think I'm very glad to hear that in nowadays environment you have, let's say, MSF raising the data integrity issue. Because when we raised it first in the PQ, kicking out quite a number of products from the list, and afterwards a lot of voluntary withdrawn, further data integrity issue quite some time ago, the public perception was that we are really very bad guys. Now it seems that other people start to understand more widely the data integrity, and this is why we are also dealing with that a bit in a wider context. And we try to have also presentation about the data integrity in our meeting with the manufacturers and suppliers to the PQ in Copenhagen, where we got all the manufacturers and our stakeholders together to talk about this problem, because it's time to put it openly on the table. I agree, because there is increasingly coming, partly also, I could say, due to the pressures to deliver with very low price medicines, extremely competitive environment, procurement organizations are lower price, lower price, lower price, and that is also putting to the manufacturers additional pressure and some sort of a temptation to cut the corners and try to go into the path of data manipulation or data fraud, if to put it openly speaking. And that is really a worrying trend, and we are aware and will try to do that. Second is, of course, concrete products from concrete manufacturers. You have to do some sort of risk analysis where you are and looking on the supply. This is access and availability and risks. And in each case, you have to do very careful balancing act between the risks you take and the potential disruption of the supply. And this is why we have, in certain cases, while being fully aware and working together with other regulators, keeping certain products still on, because some facilities are better off than others, and some products may less risk than others, because some companies have also huge number of facilities. So it's a bit complex issue. But I agree. So I hope it was giving at least some answer.
Thank you, merci. If there is no other comment or... Oh, yes, please. You come to the microphone. Yeah.
I just wanted to react to the question and to the comment previously about the pharmacist and the supply chain. And of course, it's obvious that pharmacist is a very important part of the supply chain. And there are already initiatives. We are already cooperating with other healthcare professionals and also with the intergovernmental organization on the facilitating of the detection of the SSFFC and working towards the better future in this regard. Thank you very much.
Okay, please.
I wanted to you, Dr. Rembo, you were talking about companies take this very seriously. I wanted to give a very personal example. I was working for the lymphatic filariasis program and went to India. I always travel with some antibiotics because one never quite knows what's going to happen. Unfortunately, my suitcase was in Zurich and I was in Mumbai. And I had picked up an infection somewhere. I went to the pharmacy in the Oberoi Hotel, talked to the pharmacist, explained my situation. He was very knowledgeable. He was trying to do a good job. The pharmacy was very well kept. He gave me some antibiotics, and after 3 days, I still hadn't gotten better. And I thought, my God, what do I have? My suitcase arrived, I started with the antibiotics having been bought here in Switzerland. When I got back to Switzerland, I sent the remaining tablets to Bayer. I got back a letter with 2 signatures, head of research, executive director of research, and the head of legal, with a long list of where I bought it, where was it stored, et cetera, how hot was it ever in the heat, et cetera. And but it was in a big hotel. The pharmacy had been, was air conditioned. So it wasn't that it was 40 degrees outside and the antibiotic was heat sensitive. But yes, the companies take it very seriously. A double signature like that with those 2 people shows they were taking it very, very seriously. The other thing is you can regulate until the cows come home, and there will be problems. I was inspecting with my team a pharmaceutical manufacturer, and we were outside just to get some air. We had a break. And I see a truck pull up. We were 4 people. We see a truck pull up, and they start loading the boxes of the medicines that had been manufactured in that site. So we walked over to look at the truck. It was absolutely filthy. That truck was also used to transport pesticides. So you're putting pharmaceuticals that they try to do a good job, and it may become contaminated with something like pesticides. As I say, you can regulate until the cows come home. Things will happen, but you know that.
And I didn't say anything against what you said.
Okay, so thank you for these comments and answers and presentation. I think it was really interesting to hear you. I wish you good luck for the following of your works, and see you next time. Maybe not for the 100th anniversary, but before. Huh?
Thank you.
I'm afraid I probably may miss the 100th anniversary.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.
Yes.